The next session is gastric cancer. How does it develop? So we're going to look at kind of mechanisms on the progression to gastric cancer. So again, another interesting session with great speakers. I'd like to introduce the moderators for this session. We have Scott Kuwada, who's the chairman of medicine at the University of Hawaii. If you see me talking to him a lot, I'm lobbying for a job there. No, just kidding. Part-time. And then we have Dan Lee, who's from Kaiser Permanente, and he's one of our leading gastric cancer researchers who will also be giving a great presentation later on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the moderators.
Good morning, everybody, and we have a great session next about gastric cancer, how it develops. I'm Dan Lee from Kaiser Permanente, and with Dr. Kuwada from University of Hawaii, and we have wonderful speakers for this session. So it's my, I'm going to introduce this one. It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Parsonnet from Stanford University. Dr. Parsonnet, she's a true a pioneer and expert, a world expert on gastric cancer and H. pylori research. She's a professor of medicine and epidemiology at Stanford. She has published multiple important papers in gastric cancer and H. pylori in top journals, including Lancet and JAMA and New England Journal of Medicine, to name a few. So it's a great pleasure for us to welcome Dr. Parsonnet to give some insights about H. pylori from a historical standpoint.
Thank you so much, and it's really such a pleasure to see you all here in my home turf here, which is, and thank you both for the organizers and all the speakers who are here today. And you always know that you're old when you're asked to give a talk that talks about the history of something. So, and looking at the audience here, I think of this as all like yesterday. All this stuff that I'm going to be talking about is yesterday, but a lot of it happened before many of you were born, which is pretty sad to me. But the history actually of this work actually goes back a longer time, and I'm going to just mention it with Napoleon. So do people know what Napoleon died of? So I heard it over there. He died of gastric cancer. So people think that he may have died of arsenic poisoning, but actually, because there was all these sort of, he did have arsenic in his hair, and there was arsenic in paint and all sorts of stuff. But he had an autopsy, and he died of gastric cancer. And he said, I'm going to just come back to this later. Our hour is marked, and no one can claim a moment of life beyond what fate has predestined. So he believed in predestiny. And this is his pedigree. So each one of these, the solids are gastric cancer in his family, and the ones with the lines, the vertical lines in them, are people in his family who are thought to have had gastric cancer. And you can see that he has a lot of gastric cancer in his family. And that actually shaped a lot of the thought about gastric cancer in the 19th century, where they thought that gastric cancer was something that went within families and something that might have been genetic. And, well, not genetic because they didn't know about genes, but hereditary. And they talked about this whole hereditary thing of gastric cancer even back as early as the early 19th century. But they actually didn't even know what cancer was at the time, and they didn't know what cancer was. So actually, I'm just going to step back for a second. I'm going to talk about a lot of great names in gastric cancer and in cancer historically, and I'm going to miss a lot of the wonderful people. So there have been a ton of people who have done fantastic, groundbreaking work in gastric cancer, and I'm just going to just highlight a few people, but I'm going to miss some of the many people, some of whom may be in this room. So I apologize for that, but in 15 minutes, we can't name everybody. This is Virchow. And he was the person who first understood cancer. So before him, cancer was thought to be an alien disease, something that was coming into your body and attacking you from outside. And he was the first person to say that cancer came from human cells, and that it actually was developing an abnormal growth of human tissue. And he also noticed, he established this whole idea of the irritation theory of cancer, which is that cancer arises from tissue that is being disrupted or irritated or bothered or sort of like poked at constantly. And so and that's something that we still talk about today. The inflammation theory of cancer began with him, and he talked about things like schistosomiasis and bladder cancer and all sorts of irritation theories like that. Actually, a brilliant human being. But they didn't know about bacteria then. And so we learned about bacteria with Pasteur and Koch and the other leaders. And actually at the end of the 19th century, this is a drawing, I can't remember where I got it from, but it's a drawing of organisms that were found in breast cancer tissue. And somebody put it in a book and they did all these drawings of the organisms that they were convinced caused breast cancer, because after Pasteur and after Koch, they thought everything, all cancers, everything was an infectious disease. And obviously this is, true and unrelated. If you culture, these were like breast cancers with ulcers, and we know that if you culture any soft, exposed tissue, you're going to see organisms. So this has nothing to do with reality. But this is part of this whole idea that cancers were infectious. And in fact, public health departments used to go by these homes of people who had cancer and try to quarantine people so that they couldn't give the cancer to other people, which is part of where this fear of cancer came from that we've all lived with in our lifetime. So then now I'm going to skip to Osler, who, for those of you who didn't go to medical school in the United States, Osler is kind of considered the god of modern medicine in the United States. And he actually wrote a book about stomach cancer in the late 19th century. And first of all, stomach cancer was 30% of all cancers in the United States when he wrote this book, over 30%. So it was a huge issue. We're talking about the decline, and we're talking about, it's the fourth leading cause of death. But here, it was the cause of cancer death. So it was very, very common. But again, they didn't really know what cancer was, so they thought all cancers were really much the same disease, and this was just the same disease in the stomach, but cancer in the intestine might be the same process. They didn't kind of distinguish them by the site of the tumor. He found it was twice as common in men, and that he said it was more common in foreign-born. Some of these things might sound kind of familiar. And then he suspected it might be hereditary. He went back to Napoleon and said, well, people think it's hereditary. I'm not really sure. There are some families it looks like it's hereditary, others not. But he did raise this issue of local irritation as being the issue that was involved in stomach cancer, and raised the possibility that this was because of some contagion. So this is still an old theory. Now, the highlight of the early period of stomach cancer comes with this man, whose name is Johannes Fibiger. Anybody, just curious if anybody know who Johannes Fibiger is? He won the Nobel Prize for showing the cause of stomach cancer in 1927. And what he showed was that there was a worm, and do I have a pointer in here? I guess I can do the mouse maybe. I don't know if you can see my mouse here.
Yes.
So this is a worm in cross-section in the stomach of a human being, and this is of a rat, and this is the stomach of the rat in cross-section. And he said that this worm, which was in the rat's stomach, was causing this picture here of this abnormal mucosa, which he said was a cancer, and that it was this worm that was causing cancer in these rats. And this was a huge, groundbreaking thing, really finding a cause of cancer in an animal. And he won the Nobel Prize in 1927 for that, and then he died soon after, and then this whole thing was refuted. So he never knew that he was completely wrong. And he was completely wrong from a number of respects. Number one, they didn't have cancer. This was a papillomatous condition, but it wasn't a malignancy. And these rats were, by the way, the rats got this worm by eating cockroaches, and he'd gotten these rats from the cockroaches and the rats that were in a sugar factory. And it ends up that these rats were suffering from vitamin A deficiency. They weren't suffering from anything from this worm, and it was later reproduced that you could, using vitamin A deficient rats, can reproduce this entire picture. So it had nothing to do with the worm, and it wasn't a malignancy. Other than that, it was perfect. So that, again, is the early, but I just want to say that this is about the enthusiasm people had at that time for finding infectious causes of malignancy. So now I'm going to mention three other people who, some of whom will look very familiar to you, that were really pivotal in this field. And one of them I had never heard about until recently when I was reading the history of stomach cancer. And that's the guy on the left named Kojecki, who's a Polish physician who studied in Germany. And actually he's from the Germany that was part Germany then, but it's now part of Poland. And he actually resected stomachs of humans and looked at them under the microscope. And first of all of you who are, anybody who is a pathologist knows that's not a really great way to look at the stomach, because the stomach eats itself after, has autolysis after death, so you get a lot of disruption of the mucosa. But he did do that, and he developed a technique for saving the stomach so that you can, preserving the stomach so that you can look at it. And I'm just going to quote a few things he wrote. He said, "Ulcer and gastric cancer can develop against the background of silent inflammation of the GI tract. If we can prevent the development of gastritis or treat it, we can prevent the formation of ulcers and the development of gastric cancer." And then he went on and said, "It was remarkable to observe a close correlation between grade of gastritis and the number of the bacteria lying on the mucosa. In the fundus region with little or no inflammation, I could not find any bacteria. In contrast, they were extensive in areas with severe gastritis, with loss of specific glands, occurrence of secondary atrophy, and the regions of the crypts and between them, as well as in the necks of the glands." That could have been written 5 years ago, last year, right? It sounds really good. And then, so that was in 1923. And in 1937, he wrote saying, "Ulcer and gastric cancer will be developed through silent inflammation. We are unable to distinguish between gastritis causing benign ulcer and that causing gastric cancer. When we are able to prevent gastritis or treat it, we will prevent ulcer and gastric cancer." So really old information. So the next person, I don't know if the gastroenterologists are familiar with him. I had not known about him, but he is Basil Hershowitz. And his main contribution is that he developed the fibroscopic gastroscope, so that you could actually go in and get tissue and you didn't have to go to autopsies. You can look at live human beings and actually get tissue and see the progression of what's going on in the stomach over time. And that was a huge, huge advance. There have been people who had looked before, but they weren't able to get good biopsies, and it wasn't flexible. So he was actually the father of the flexible gastroscope, so that you can actually look all around the stomach and actually inspect it in real life. And the last incredible pioneer is someone who we all know and some of us are very close to, is Pelayo Correa, who took advantage of our ability to look at the stomach to really map out how the stomach ages in populations and how the stomach ages in populations at high risk for stomach cancer and at lower risk of stomach cancer. He did much of that work in his native country of Colombia, but he also did that in other places around the world, and other groups did this as well, especially in Northern Europe, in Estonia and Finland and places like that, where they did a lot of surveys using the gastroscope. But Pelayo Correa came up with what is called the Correa model, which is actually still something that we think about today. And he did this by, this was published in the 1970s. And he did this again by looking at populations at higher risk for cancer, at lower risk for cancer, and seeing how their stomachs progressed. And he said, well, you have a normal stomach, and then it gets superficial gastritis, and then you develop atrophic gastritis within that superficial gastritis, and then you might develop intestinal metaplasia of different variant types, then dysplasia, and then malignancy. And he hypothesized what the steps were that were causing that. So he talks about dietary things and also ways to prevent it. And I'm just going to give you a different picture of it here because I think it's a little bit easier to read, where he would say, looking at each of these steps, that the first step to chronic gastritis might be caused by too much salt in the diet and decreases in fresh fruits and vegetables. And then these later stages might be related to eating a lot of nitrates, which are converted to N-nitrosamines through various steps, and a lack of things that would prevent that from happening, in particular ascorbic acid. So he had done a lot of research about this and looked at this as the progression, and that progression we still talk about all the time. So it was a huge step for this field. And then, of course, these guys came along. Robin Warren on the right and Barry Marshall on the left, who discovered the cause of gastritis. And Robin Warren had noticed that whenever he saw gastritis, he saw these organisms on the mucosa, and he asked Barry Marshall to investigate it. Barry was ultimately able to culture it. He ate the organism, gave himself gastritis, lots of great steps. But I want to, and it was really amazing, and very persistent they were very persistent in moving this forward. They had a lot of people who really poo-pooed the whole idea and said this wasn't true and it wasn't real, and really their greatest asset was they knew they were right and they didn't let anybody tell them they were wrong. But this was their first paper. Just so you know, those of you who are junior investigators, this is their first paper they submitted to the Gastroenterology Society of Australia. And I don't want you to read the whole thing, except they submitted an abstract. And they had 67 abstracts that were submitted, and they were rejected because they could only take 56. So they ultimately went on to win the Nobel Prize. But they were not among the 56 of the 67 abstracts that were selected, showing the association between H. pylori and gastritis. So, after H. pylori was discovered, that box of salt and decreased fruits and vegetables turned into H. pylori, because it became increasingly apparent in the 1980s that H. pylori did cause gastritis. It was associated with it, and it was linked experimentally by Barry and by others to gastritis, and eradicating the organism got rid of gastritis. So if you believe this Pelayo-Correa model and said that gastritis is a necessary precursor for gastric cancer, then it was going to be intuitively obvious that H. pylori caused gastric cancer. There's no two ways about it. If it causes the precursor, it's necessary for the precursor, then it's going to be necessary for these later cancers. But then we went through a series of decades of work showing that this was true, even though I think it was obvious at the time. And these are some of the seminal studies about it. On the left are the nested case control studies, which are studies in which serum was obtained from people, and those people were followed over time. And they looked to see whether the people who had antibodies to H. pylori were at highest risk of gastric cancer. And the first study was done by David Foreman, who is a great cancer epidemiologist, was working at the time at Leeds and later went to the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And then the next two were ours and the one done by Marty Blazer in Hawaii. And after those first three studies were done, the World Health Organization said, enough, I think this is true. And they declared H. pylori a definite cause of cancer in humans. And that was, I think, in the early 1990s that they said that. I actually wasn't enthusiastic at the time about that declaration because I thought we had a lot more work to do, because H. pylori is associated with many things, including poverty. And a lot of cancers are diseases of poverty. And I wasn't really, I thought we needed to do more work. Not that I didn't think it was true, but I thought we needed more work before we said it was definitely true. But there were many other nested case control studies like this that happened over time. The next major step was looking at these early gastric cancers that we've heard about this morning. And this was the seminal study that was done by Imura, or this early study. It wasn't a perfect study, but an early study that was done on early gastric cancer resection. And what they were looking at is if they took out the early gastric cancers and then they treated the people with H. pylori or didn't treat people with H. pylori, who survived, who got secondary cancers. And they were looking not at the same location, they were looking at metachronous cancers, so cancers that were occurring in other parts of the stomach. So they resected the early gastric cancer, treated half with H. pylori, the other half they didn't, and looked to see recurrence. And you could see that the ones that were not treated had recurrent gastric cancer, and the ones that were treated did not. It was a small study, and there were issues about not being randomized, but it was still a very, very important study in letting people know that this actually not only was H. pylori associated with gastric cancer, but that treating it might prevent it. And then there was the next major study in this field was the one by Benjamin Wang that was done in China, where they actually did a randomized clinical trial and looked to see whether H. pylori prevented gastric cancer. And this is the slide from their follow-up paper. So they did an early paper, and the data were suggestive that it worked, but the sample size wasn't big enough. They went back a number of years later and looked at the same population and found that there was actually a significant decrease in gastric cancer in people who had H. pylori eradicated compared to those that received placebo. And that this was particularly important in people who didn't have, that had no precancerous lesions, saying that you might want to hit these patients with H. pylori therapy earlier in the course of treatment. So these are really the seminal papers that have gotten us to where we are with the H. pylori picture. And so now everything else is the icing on the cake, and figuring out how it happens and trying to figure out the strategies for treatment and prevention, which I think are really hard. We're going to hear a lot about this in this conference, about what approaches should we take, and we heard about it actually in the last session as well. What are the right approaches, especially in low-risk populations and in high-risk populations and in populations where you can't get endoscopy easily, like Native Americans in Alaska? A lot of very challenging questions. But now we have other things like we've been able to find in this slide. They talk about all the mutations. This is a group that just published that this year from Palermo. And they are just went through all the mutations that happen at these various stages. We learned a lot about it. We've also learned a lot about the molecular subtypes of gastric cancer. On the left, you can see the genome atlas that's been done for gastric cancer, showing that there are multiple different types. They all have different risk factors. They all have different ways of us approaching them. And the H. pylori associated one, I think, is it's the blue one. Can't remember which one it is. But there are these 4 different forms of cancer, and we're also looking now at how this happens mechanistically and what's happening with H. pylori in the stomach. I'm not going to go through all these various slides, just to say that these are the details of gastric cancer that are coming out of the work of all this prior work that's been done by these great investigators. So I'm going to just end with my last slide on Napoleon, where he said that the bullet that will kill me is not yet cast, and that was before Waterloo. Oops. But I will say that the bullet that killed him was cast at that point. He was probably infected with H. pylori, and the reason that he died of stomach cancer is that he had H. pylori, and he probably got it from his parents, and he was carrying it for all his life, and those members of his family had it as well. So that's where I'm going to stop with the history, and looking forward to hearing the rest of the talks.